Good afternoon. I'm Andrea Addis-Vasquez, PSC First Vice President. I want to thank you for tuning into this roundtable discussion, Labor and Communities Fight for Budget Justice. Before I introduce the panelists, I want to say a word about today. This conversation is part of a 24-hour virtual demonstration that's the culmination of a summer of struggle for our union and the start of an even more intense period of action as we confront ever greater attacks on all things public. This summer, our union has joined in cries for racial justice, education justice, and budget justice. This panel will demonstrate the importance of coalition work and expand our knowledge on the need for new revenue to fund public services and the public good. CUNY is one of the public goods that yields huge gains for New Yorkers and the whole city. As we know, budgets are political documents, and austerity budgeting is a series of unjust decisions. We on this panel and in our union share a different set of priorities from those that have taken hold in Albany, and we would make a different set of decisions. Today, we'll hear from some who are in the lead in addressing this crisis of funding and priorities. We agree on the need to drastically shift the structure of favoring the ultra-wealthy and starving everyone else. We'll look at data and facts and actions that we've taken. We'll be discussing the specifics of what we're facing now and what we must do to end the disinvestment in institutions such as CUNY. So I'm glad to say we have today with us Charles Kahn, the Organizing Director of Strong Economies for All, Jonas Scheinda, Chief Economist at the Fiscal Policy Institute, Haylin Choi, New York State Political Director of CWA District 1, Mike Fabricant, PSC Legislative Representative, and Tiffany Brown, PSC Legislative Communications Associate. And Bettina Damiani, PSC Research and Policy Director, will also be joining the conversation. After we hear from each presenter, we'll give them some time to respond to each other, and then we hope to take some questions from viewers. Because we have a hard end time, I'll need to let you know when you're running out of time, so forgive me for that in advance. So let's move to Charles Kahn, please.
Hi, my name is Charles Kahn. I'm the Organizing Director at the Strong Economy for All Coalition. And for the past several years, and particularly in this past year, I have been working with the New York State Budget Justice Coalition, really working on the New York State budget to see how we can get the most money from the wealthiest people across the state and invest it in the programs and the institutions that we know work, that we know help kind of the most marginalized historically and presently, Black and Brown communities, immigrants, the working class. And so I just wanted to briefly go over, just kind of a PowerPoint that we put together that kind of goes over a little bit of the history, but also kind of contextualizes the present situation that we're in and why this fight for revenue is kind of the hallmark of what New York is going to look like in the coming months and years. And so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, give me a second. I'm having a little bit of a technical difficulty. Okay, so I may not be able to share my screen, but I can go over and I can illustrate through my words kind of what's been going on in New York State. And so before the pandemic, I don't want to make it out to seem like New York was, milk and honey. And the 1% in New York made roughly 44 times more than the bottom 99% statewide. Inequality was very, very bad in the state. In fact, it was the worst in the entire country. And we know that we had been suffering from decades of austerity budgets that kind of made and forced New Yorkers to try and do more with less, and also divestment, historical trends of racism that created the disparities that we see now in housing and education and outcomes and wealth and in income. And so that was all before the pandemic, right? Pataki, Patterson, Cuomo, all kind of did things that made it harder fiscally for the state to respond to its needs. And then COVID-19 happened. And I think for most of the time, what I say is COVID-19 was a black light in one sense, right? It highlighted all of the problems that we already had and brought them to the forefront, but it also made things much, much worse. It's made inequality in the state much worse. What we've seen is that the wealthiest individuals they're making so much more than they made before the pandemic. And the people that were struggling, the people that were barely kind of treading water, barely making it, are doing worse. Millions are unemployed, and millions more are struggling to keep up with their bills and provide for their family. And in fact, New York has lost more than 2 million jobs. Unemployment rates are still rising in many places. And it's causing a crisis that we need to address, and that will only get worse if we choose not to address it. And I do want to juxtapose that with the fact that at the very top, the very, very, very top, billionaires in particular, wealth is exploding, right? At the beginning of the year, we had 112 billionaires, which is a lot. It is an incredible amount. But now we actually have 118 billionaires, and we've seen their wealth go up $77 billion to roughly $600 billion just since the pandemic has started. So it's been a windfall for them. And what we've seen happen in the politics and around the state is the governor talking about, the fiscal situation that New York's government is in, and New York's kind of public is in, what looks like a $14 billion budget gap, and how if Donald Trump and Mitch McConnell, two people I wouldn't bet anything on, don't come through for New York State, we're going to be forced to balance the budget, $14 billion, on the backs of New Yorkers in need, with cuts to public services, cuts to K through 12 and higher education, to healthcare, to housing, all of the things that we know we can't afford to cut, that we should be spending more money than we were previously on. But that's not the only option, right? Cuomo says that's the only option, but what we know is that if we just look at all of the wealth that a small amount of New Yorkers have, we can raise taxes, right? We can make our tax system actually progressive. Right now, the wealthiest New Yorkers pay less in taxes than they've ever paid nationally, but they also pay less in taxes in New York than the average New Yorker. And so by just raising their taxes, actually by a pretty small percentage, we could raise billions of dollars. 90% of New Yorkers support that. And we could close in totality or even just a part of the budget gap by raising taxes on those individuals.
Charles,
and it's happened.
Charles, would you like me to share my screen so you can show your slides?
Sure.
Whatever you prefer. Okay.
Yeah, that works. I'm sure it's more visually entertaining than my hands waving across the screen. And so I'm on slide 9.
Okay, I'll try.
And so we could raise taxes, and that's actually what New York has historically done, is raise taxes on the wealthy. FDR did it. Nelson Rockefeller did it. Even David Patterson, who's now saying he's against taxes, he passed the Millionaires Tax in 2009 when we were in the middle of the Great Depression, to help the state meet its needs and finance programs that are incredibly important. And so that's what we need to be doing now, right? We need to be demanding that the wealthy pay more than they have, demanding that they pay more, demanding that they pay a fairer share so that we all could survive. And there's a number of ways to do that, because we really have to ask ourselves, like, what's worth more to us, right? Like the millions of people in New York surviving, or, making sure that the billionaires in New York State are happy. And so there's about $14 billion of budget cuts. We have put together a plan that has roughly $25 billion. There's other plans that have even more money in taxes on the rich. So we could more than close the budget gap with these taxes. And the first is—
so if the host can please show my screen, thanks.
Yeah,
okay.
Great. And so now I'm on 12 now. Sorry. And so the first is a billionaire's tax. It's a wealth tax, right? It would be a tax on the capital gains of people that have more than $1 billion in wealth. Currently, billionaires only pay taxes if they decide to sell shares of their company or their stock. But many of them, they use, high-powered accountants. They may never pay any taxes on this. And by doing a small tax, a 2% tax on the wealth of those billionaires, we would raise $5.5 billion. We could fund emergency aid to essential workers and have money left over for education and other programs that we know that we need. There's also an ultra millionaires tax, right? New York has over 40,000 households that earn over $1 million a year. And if we raise taxes a small percentage on people that make $1 million, over 5 million or over $1 million every single year, they don't have $1 million saved up somewhere. They're making more than $5 million every single year. We could raise somewhere between 2.5 and 4.5 billion dollars, depending on what percentage rate we used. Additionally, taxes on vacation homes. Right now, New York City, there's been lots of stories about how the millionaires and billionaires have fled to their other houses, their other mansions, their other condos. And most other international cities like Paris or London, they have taxes on luxury second or third non-primary homes of the wealthy. And if New York did something similar, we would raise $650 million. Stock transfer tax. We all pay sales tax on groceries. We pay sales tax on gas and other things that we buy. But when people buy and sell stocks, especially the big Wall Street firms and investment banks, they don't pay anything. In fact, New York used to have a sales tax on it. And then in the 80s, New York started rebating it. And so every year, New York rebates, they give Wall Street a coupon that's worth roughly $13 billion. And if we got rid of that coupon, we could keep that $13 billion because we need it. And also, a kind of ad hoc to that is there's a stock buyback tax, which would be new sales tax only on stock buybacks. Stock buybacks are a financial tool that companies often use to take their profits and kind of funnel them to their shareholders and to CEOs instead of funneling them to workers. It's something that shouldn't happen at all. But if the federal government isn't going to stop it, what we should do is make sure that we tax the hell out of it. Mezzanine debt. I live in a Brooklyn apartment. I do not own it. I am not that fortunate. But for the homeowners out there, I'm sure they're all familiar with the mortgage reporting tax. It is a tax that you pay if you have a mortgage. But Wall Street firms and banks, when they buy condos and multi-unit apartment buildings, they use something called mezzanine debt. It's the same as a mortgage, but they use it and they don't have to pay the mortgage reporting tax. And so we just like to equalize that. So they're paying the same tax that everyone else is paying on buying homes, and that would raise $500 million. And in talking about taxes, you're going to hear this a lot. And we've heard it from Cuomo, and it's going to be that if we raise taxes, we will destroy New York, all of the wealthy people will leave, and we will be in a worse situation. And frankly, it's not true. And there are people others on this call, experts on the call that also talk about it. But what we've seen in the past is that when we raise taxes, not only the wealthy don't all get up and leave. If they wanted to go to a low tax place, they could have moved to Kansas a long time ago, but they're here for a reason. And some may leave, but ultimately in the end, we'll still be better off, right? Because the small amount that leave, we still end up having more money for New York State to pay our bills in the end. And in most situations, like what we saw with the Millionaires Tax, after we passed the Millionaires Tax, we also saw more millionaires. There's 83% more millionaires in New York State since David Paterson passed the Millionaires Tax in 2009. And so that's really what we have to look at. The millionaires aren't going anywhere. They're making more money. We actually have more billionaires than we've ever had. And middle class and lower income New Yorkers they're paying more, they're receiving less, and we're on the verge of instituting devastating cuts. And so really, we just need to address income inequality, and we need to make sure that New Yorkers are okay. New York has the tools. New York has the resources to do that. Yes, we're going to need help from the federal government. That is awesome. But New York has more billionaires than just about every other state. And what we can do and what we should be doing is asking them to pay more so that we all can survive. And in order to do that, we're going to have to continue to work in coalition. The Budget Justice Coalition is a broad coalition. What I do is kind of work in coalitions, and the only way to do it is to stay together, because otherwise what Cuomo will do is they'll kind of they'll cause infighting, right? They'll say, hey, PSC, if you want money for CUNY, if you don't want tuitions to go up, if you want teachers to get paid what they owe, then you're going to need to abandon, essential workers, or you're going to need to abandon the housing folks. So you're going to need to abandon the homeless folks. And we know that we can't do that. And that's why it's so important to continue to do actions together, to continue to strategize together, and continue to fight together. I mean, I think we're having this fight, and this fight is being buoyed by all of the other fights that are happening, not just in New York, but across the country. And so I want to thank everyone for being on. I'm sorry if I went a little bit long, but numbers and Texas get me excited. But yeah, I'm happy to stay on and answer any questions. Yeah, thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. We will be having questions later. And who knows if you went on too long? I couldn't see my agenda. So I think we will now move on to Jonas from Fiscal Policy Institute. But first, actually, before we do that, I didn't realize earlier that our president, PSC President Barbara Bowen, is also with us on the panel. So we will look forward to hearing from her as well later. Thanks, Jonas.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for putting this panel together. I will not take long because everything that I would say is very easily summarizable. The fiscal situation in the state of New York is quite dire, and the challenges are quite severe. And potentially, these challenges are going to be long-standing. So, with that preamble out of the way, let me just give you a little bit of details what we are actually dealing with. Just a year ago, speaking about CUNY, just about a year ago, CUNY was in the news because it was fighting overcrowding. It was fighting too many students and the rise of enrollment, and of course it needed more resources to meet that growing demand. 1 year later, of course, the situation is 180 degrees the opposite. The enrollment is not as high. There's a lot of uncertainty about what is going to happen to the schedules, how many classes are going to be taught, who is going to be teaching those classes, and of course, all of that is quite serious. So, but what remains though is the need for funding. Some institutions, especially the public institutions, publicly relevant institutions in the state of New York, have been, and in the city, have been historically and chronically underfunded. So CUNY is one of them. We all know MTA is another, now facing $16 billion deficit. So the state of New York had dealt with deficits for a while. we started this fiscal year, the conversations about the beginning of the budget negotiations was started with about $6 billion projected revenue, a budget gap. Now, of course, when we talk about budget projections, they're just that's just what analysts project to happen in the future. So the gap was projected, and some people took it seriously, some people didn't take it seriously. It was a political thing, maybe, but as time went on, and we didn't, and we started dealing with not only the usual budget negotiations, but with the pandemic, the projected gap became real, and then it became deeper. So now we're staring at $13 billion of a budget deficit for this year. So for 2 years, this year and next year, that's $30 billion a deficit. So that's about 14% of revenue that we're losing. And so between now and fiscal 2024, we're looking at 64. The state is looking at 61 to $64 billion in lost revenue. So that is a hole that is very difficult to plug unless we're, as a state, unless we're willing to do something new and be policy innovators, and unless we are doing something really creative. And the city of New York, that also pays quite a significant portion for CUNY, is facing its own budget problems. And this year we are looking at $9 billion in deficit. So just to remind you, was it just a couple of years ago, the city, or maybe a year ago, I think time is running very, very fast now, about a year ago, we had a budget surplus, right? So we go from surplus situation to a deficit situation, very severe deficit in just 1 year, and that is, again, quite drastic. So both the city and the state leadership now are looking at the types of measures that are very predictable. Those measures are cuts, the rolling cuts or projected cuts on the order of 20% of personnel or services. That, of course, cannot be considered acceptable if you want to have an economically strong and vibrant New York. And CUNY is a very central part of that vibrancy and dynamism.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jonas. I know the PSC relies heavily on your research and analysis. We're now moving to Halen Choi, who's the New York State Political Director of CWA.
Hi, Andrea. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Halen Choi. I'm the State Political Director of the Communications Workers of America, CWA District 1. We represent about 140,000 members in New York, New Jersey, and New England, and about 65,000 in New York working in telecom, healthcare, and public sector. And many of you may not know that we also represent grad students. So we, first of all, let me say we stand in solidarity with PSC and PSC demanding justice and fighting against budget cuts. And so I'm glad to be here. Always great to be with friends in labor. This is really amazing what you're doing with this 24-hour day of action. And I wanted to talk a little bit about how CWA has been dealing with the budget crisis and the work that we've been doing with our friends in labor. So as I mentioned, we represent about 15,000 workers working in healthcare and public sector. And at this point, we sort of come to this place that we think revenue and raising revenue is kind of the mother of all problems, because it's kind of in the way of everything else that we're fighting for, right? We are trying to fight for our healthcare workers, for additional staffing in hospitals, but we can't get to that because the state has no money, hospitals have no money, right? We're representing our grad students in the CUNY systems, and they've been fighting against fees that they have to pay, which is, just a way to implement backdoor tuition, but we can't get to that because there's no revenue, right? So it's kind of become the mother of all problems. And that's why we have organized with many other unions at the beginning of the year to form a coalition really asking for progressive revenue. And it's just like Jonas and Charles said, at the beginning of the year, when we got together, a $6 billion deficit was the biggest budget crisis we had been facing in decades, right? And now we're looking at 13 billion, 30 billion, potentially 60 billion over the next couple of years. And we cannot cut our way out of this crisis, right? And this crisis is a global health pandemic, and that has triggered a historic economic crisis. And so in this situation, to be thinking about closing hospitals, laying off healthcare workers, laying off teachers is just mind-blowing, right? I mean, this is not going to help us out of this crisis. We have to think about how we rebuild this economy, how we get back on track, and use this crisis to build better system. I really loved how Charles said that COVID-19 has been a little bit like a black light, shining like a bright light on all the holes that and inequities and how the system has failed us, but also made it so much worse. So I think it's incumbent on us to really make sure that we do everything we can to build a better, stronger economy. And so the union coalition that we have been working with includes really, like our great friends in labor, PSC, of course, SEIU 1199, DC 37, PATH, NISNA, NICID, RWDSU, UAW, Region 9A, and also the AFL-CIO. And we've been working together since the beginning of the year. We organized big rallies in Albany. We had several budget briefings with a lot of the friends who are on this panel here right now, really talking us through how the fact that New York State has a regressive tax system is really the foundation of the inequality, right? That we don't have a system where the more money you make, the more taxes you pay, but we have a system where, the more money you make, the less taxes you pay. And we really need to change that, because that is just a foundational structure on which this inequality that is really blown out of proportion is growing. And so now that we are in this situation in COVID-19 and sort of the legislature also kind of on our side, right? And this is a welcoming switch of direction, because the state doesn't have a lot of options in this moment right now, right? I mean, we can wait until we're blue in the face for the federal government to send us money, and whatever the federal government will send us, and we're fighting really hard for it, will not be enough, right? Because again, at the beginning of the year, we were already facing a historic budget crisis. So we really need to make sure that going forward, and this is why it's great that, labor and community working together on this, that we build a tax system that is fair and that it asks those who can afford more, who probably wouldn't even notice if they would be paying a little more, that they really need to chip in. Thank you.
Great. Okay, we're now going to hear from Mike Fabricant, PSC legislation. Thanks.
Thanks. I want to thank the prior folks who reported on the coalition and the circumstance of the state. I think there are valuable pieces in each of those presentations. What CUNY members, that is members of the PSC, need to learn in this process. But I want to also point out, before I get to the power of alliance, which is in part what I've been asked to do, to talk about the power of CUNY as an economic engine. I think I'd be remiss if I didn't speak to that. We know that studies have been done at CCNY and Queens by private firms. And those private firms have suggested or indicated, they don't suggest it, they've indicated on the basis of rigorous analysis that both Queens and CCNY add billions of dollars annually, and the study was done in 2019, to the New York City economy. That is a 2019 study. This is not a 2010, 2000. If we're going to rebuild the city, CUNY is going to be a powerful economic engine in that process. We know that CUNY students stay in New York City. That's a multiplier right there relative to other schools. We also know that CUNY has the best record nationally in moving students disproportionately, largely Black and brown students from poverty into the middle class. Again, an economic multiplier. And yet, this is not new for CUNY, as Lynn pointed out. These cutbacks are not new, as Jonas pointed out earlier as well, and Charles. This is a long-term set of there's a long process of divestment or disinvestment of public agencies. But CUNY, I think, has suffered especially. Since, somewhere around 2008, the state investment controlling for inflation for senior colleges has declined by 21%. That is a significant drop prior to COVID. And we have these two realities. We have a reality of a university that's making an enormous contribution to the city's economic development. And on the other side, we have a state that is really savaging the basic fiscal underpinnings of that goose that's laying golden eggs, frankly, for the city. Now, having said all that, we know that alliance and power is the only way for us to go. We've got to build a united power. And as Charles pointed out, we can't be simply focused on, if we're going to build this big tent, we've got to have many different players with many different interests, but all of whom unify around the need for greater investment and particularly taxation of the wealthy. And I think we've created that both in the union side, as Lynn spoke about, and on the grassroots budget revenue side, which Charles spoke about. And I think in combination, they've been a powerful motor in what's going on in Albany right now. And we ought to talk about what's going on in Albany right now. Charles spoke about it, but there's many, many different pieces of legislation promoting many different kinds of investment that ultimately legislators will make a decision about. But 104 legislators, as a result of Budget Revenue Justice Coalition and the union pressure, have signed on to taxing or insignificant event. To have that many legislators basically taking a pledge around taxing the wealthy, and to hear Carl Hastie and Andrea Stewart-Cousins make a 180 on that issue over the last 6 to 9 months, they've mouthed it, but they're now putting something behind it because their Assembly and Senate folk are also pressing them. We have no other alternative at this point. We have one other that state council people perhaps are pressing, which are loans, and that's fine. But in the end, everyone has to pay their fair share. If we went back and looked at taxation rates under Pataki before he changed the tax codes, and we look now and we see revenue foregone, we would be talking about tens of billions of dollars if the state tax code had remained the same when between George Pataki's entering office and presently, tens of billions. What we're talking about is returning to a tax code, even in a much more modest one, frankly, that begins to narrow the gap in a period of deep crisis for which there's historic precedent. So building these alliances are absolutely essential. And I'll name one reason, because in fact, we see an ultra-billionaire alliance emerging headed by David Paterson, former governor of this state. And that alliance is essentially indicating, as Charles pointed out, that in fact, millionaires and billionaires will leave the state if we charge them. It's all the old mythology about billionaires. And if we're not able to advance an agenda and to block their agenda through a unified alliance, they will have their way in fact, further diminishing revenue and not enhancing it. So the question for all of us is the degree to which we're prepared to engage in the very, very hard work of building alliance and in order to unify different unions, different agencies under one umbrella, pursuing the same goal. And the same goal is, in this instance, taxing the wealthy to pay their fair share. Our power is there, our power is in unity, and our power is in effect central to anything we're going to be able to achieve during this legislative session.
Great. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Mike.
We go to Tiffany, please. Oops. Can't hear you yet, Tiffany.
PSC Communications and a Legislative Associate. So I'm going to be talking about just the power of students and what the PSC has been doing when it comes to coalition building with students. I would just start with my own personal story. I am a graduate of Queens College, and my first campaign that I ever really worked on was higher education affordability. So that means I've been doing this for like 10 plus years, and I've been working with groups like PSC and NYPIRG and USS. So that always has existed, you know, between the union and students fighting for the same cause and for the same reasons. Right before COVID hit, when we were making a lot of traction, like many of our groups making a lot of traction around the TAP gap and revenue bills, the PSC took over 600 faculty and staff members from all across the state, along with USS and NYSID and NYPIRG and other groups that were really invested in higher education. And for 600 students, which we know the demographics of our students just slept all the way up to Albany, which for many of us, it might just be like, okay, Amtrak ride. But for a lot of other students, you know, it's waking up at 6 a.m., boarding a bus from a various CUNY campus and traveling up there. So like that strong connection has existed there since when I was a student and now graduated and working with the PSC. So I think that connection has always been there, and making sure that student voices are being heard. Right before this panel, I was on a panel with Giovanni and Timothy, who are, you know, related to USS or even working in elected officials' offices. And I believe it was Senator Granada said that he wanted to hear more from the students and more from the faculty. And I do think he is hearing more from them, but I also think you just have to realize that, you know, students every year go up to Albany. We are sending petition signatures. We are calling our elected officials, but now we are really calling for our elected officials to pass bills that we know exist that can really bring more, you know, economic revenue to the city university and support our students in that way, because if we're not supporting our students, who's going to continue on, you know, moving this society forward. So I definitely think that the connection is there, and we have strong ties with students. We work with them on a daily basis, whether it's the CUNY Rising Alliance. You could check out a lot of great work that the CUNY Rising Alliance has been doing that comprises of, you know, student groups, community organization, and labor. And at the root of a lot of our issues is just the fact of lack of money. And also is a lot of overlappings because we're dealing with the same demographics of population. Black and brown students continually not getting the funding that they need. So PSC is going to continue working with, you know, budget justice folks, other labor unions, and student groups to make sure that CUNY and the New Deal for CUNY is ultimately, you know, a reality.
Great. Thank you, Tiffany. Barbara, would you like to say a few words before we open up the roundtable discussion? You're muted. Oops.
Sorry. Sure. I'd like to say thank you to everyone. It was very powerful, and I've seen some of the presentations before. I've been lucky enough to see them evolve, but every time I'm struck anew with the justice of them and the importance of the simple fact. I mean, this is about redistribution of wealth, and long overdue, as Mike said. This is not even, our proposal is really addressing the source. Everything we talk about is about the economic decision, not the mistake, but the decision. And I would say it's a racist, institutionally racist decision to underfund CUNY. And that decision is also a decision that affects all the other groups we're representing here. So the point that Haylin made and Mike about coalition and Charles, that we have to do this together so that we are not pitted against each other. We all face the same issue, which is a political decision about whose lives matter. And the money follows whose lives matter. So we are in this together, and I'm very proud to be there, and hoping that together we can develop the power to win these changes at the root. That's what we're going for, changes at the root. And everyone should see there are places on our website and on NYSET's website where you can immediately send social media messages and call the legislature and the governor to demand fair taxation at last. So I'll just listen to the panelists. Thank you so much, panelists and Andrea.
Thank you. Great. Thank you, everyone. I have a question, and I think we have some questions from the audience, but I also wanted to give the panelists, everyone who's spoken, a chance to respond to each other if you'd like to do that. So any internal discussion here before we move on to questions?
Hi, this is Helen. Not so much a question, I just wanted to echo what folks on this panel have been saying, that I also really think it's important what you have been pointing out, that, you know, austerity is fake austerity, right? And austerity in this context doesn't mean we have no money. It just means we have no money for this, right? And so I just wanted to echo that, you know, what Barbara, what you were also saying, that it's a political choice to say we have no money for this, right? And I think one interesting thing that we've seen with our members is that, you know, for many, many years, we've been calling for a lot of things to build our social safety net. And on the federal level, I think it's been pretty clear that when there is really such a life-threatening emergency, we have money, right? And it just shows really what you said, that it's a political decision. And obviously when hundreds of thousands of lives are on the line, luckily, you know, our federal government came through with relief packages. But I think it showed to a lot of folks, oh, there is money. You know, all these years when they said we have no money for schools, we have no money for healthcare, actually not true, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think, you know, again, echoing what you said, this is really a political question, a question of political will, and a huge task for redistribution, because the money is there. And, you know, what you said, and this is why I think the Labor Community Coalition is so important, is we're united. So we're not fighting over the crumbs, right? Why they live in the Hamptons, laugh all the way to the bank, right? And we're pitted against each other to fight over the crumbs.
Thank you. Bettina, I'll hold off. Bettina, you said you have a question from a viewer. Would you like to read that for us?
First question. It would be good to know how people are taking advantage of the pandemic to increase their wealth. I agree that shouldn't happen, but I don't understand the logistics of it.
Jonas?
Yeah, look, it's pretty simple, right? I mean, let's say if you take a look at the, can you see me? Am I frozen?
We hear you, it's okay.
Okay, good. So it looks like it's very easy to see. One of the easiest examples is, for instance, the stock market. If you look at the stock market, yeah, and if you are significantly wealthy, and your assets have increased 100%. Basically, you had a V-shaped recovery in your assets since the beginning of the year. Now let's take a look at what actually grew. Just last week was it? Target, for instance, just reported its earnings. They're up 90%. And let's examine that specific case, just one case. What does it mean? It means that all the small shops, they all disappeared. They all went bankrupt. The people who ran them are left without money. People who worked with them are unemployed. And shoppers need to shop, so they go to Target. And Target's profits are going up. So what we're observing is this rapid acceleration of monopolization of our economy. And you can look at it in many different domains. This is just one of the most obvious ones. There is a concentration of power, and if you're on the right side of money, if you're on the right side of the asset distribution, then you're going to profit. So anyone who has real assets, who doesn't have to work to live, is gaining. And everyone who has to work to live is losing. So I would propose that our recovery has a K shape. So the one going up is for the asset people, and the leg going down is for everyone else. So we have a K-shaped recovery this year. so far.
Thank you. Bettina, do you have another question?
Not an exact question, it's a comment, but I have a feeling it will raise questions. So I'm going to mention it anyway. The comment was, maybe Millionaires should help us pay tuition and create tuition-free colleges, as in Canada and Europe. I don't think anybody here would disagree. I'm wondering, though, if the panelists can talk about maybe what is the structural differences between what's happening here in New York and the United States and with those other places that makes that work?
Well, I'll start. I mean, we see that there's a very different kind of safety net in Western Europe, both in base income, college tuition, which is free, and the consequences of that regarding sort of medical care and a whole variety of other services in many of those countries that have really contained the virus, that have contributed not only to containing the virus in many of those countries, but also maintaining a standard of living for the population. That some of that a good deal of that redistribution was occurring. So I think there are enormous differences. This country is probably at this point one of the least redistributive countries in the world. And we are showing where the results of that are increasingly being made more and more visible through the fracture within the populace, but also the decline that exists within the culture. And I just want to say that this is a moment to be bold. This is a moment not to hide from what is possible. This is an opportunity for us to be bold about what it is we demand and request. The only thing that we're lacking is the power to impose it. And that means many of us have to step up and make other kinds of choices about the power that we need to build and how we build it and what we're prepared to do to build it. But we should be bold in naming what's needed. If Western Europe can do it, if New Zealand can do it, if other parts of the world can do it, we can do it too.
Well, that's a great segue into my question, which was really talking a little more specifically about how do we escalate? I think it's clear we need to. So many of you spoke about organizing and what can we do different? What can we do more of? What can we do more powerfully to move, to change things, to change the system of taxation, to change the inequality that exists?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that any policy person will tell you that we have the policy. In many cases, we've had the policy for a long time. And in this moment, I completely agree with Mike in being bold. And I think in being bold, we have to eliminate every shadow and any type of cover that exists for our elected leaders. I think many times, whether it's Governor Cuomo or the speaker or the leader, they often say that they're on our side and we offer them cover. We give them the benefit of the doubt, and we can't afford to do that. We couldn't afford to do it before, but now that we can afford to do it even less. And it's going to take that. It's going to making them feel vulnerable at all times, making them feel judged at all times is what it's going to take to move them from their comfort zone into a position where they feel like they have to deliver or else. That they don't have the option to muddy the waters and say that they're trying and then move on. And it's, I think different folks will take different tactics, but the capitals are closed, right? We're gonna have to visit them in their offices and visit them at their homes and, find them wherever we can find them to make sure that we're being heard. Because there's a lot going on outside. There's a lot of people in the streets, but the lobbying environment right now favors moneyed interests and insiders because it's harder for regular people to reach elected officials right now. It's much easier for someone that has the governor's cell phone number or has the speaker's cell phone number to reach them. And it's going to take us to escalate to try and match that.
Thank you. Helen, were you looking to say something here?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree. And, there's this Milton Friedman quote, which I don't 100% remember, about crisis and opportunity, right? But I think for us, it means, using this crisis to create a situation where change is not an option, right? Where it's inevitable. And I think basically, what Charles said, I think we have to create a situation where it's not an option because we have the public on our side, right? I mean, I don't know if we talked about this, but, poll after poll shows that I think 9 out of 10 New Yorkers support raising taxes on the ultra wealthy, right? It's not even close. So we have the public on our side, right? We have the people on our side. And I think that's what's giving us power. But I think we really have to create a situation where it's not a choice, right? Where a crisis so big that it has to be dealt with, and it has to be dealt with in a way that really builds a foundation for a just and a real recovery. And at the same time, I would say it's already, if we're not doing this, it's already happening, right? I mean, the other side is taking advantage of this crisis. On the federal level, they try every time to build in tax breaks, right? They're trying to sell the myth that, economic development is going to get us out of this crisis. It's not like it's happening in a vacuum. And if we don't win, then, we go back to normal. No, it's going to get so much worse. And so I think we have no other choice. And I think one thing that's been really hopeful to me to see is while there was so much pain and awfulness around the Black Lives Matter movement and all these protests. And again, right, I mean, weeks later, it's just the same thing all over again. We have seen so much change, even though there's been incredible pain and hurt and such a, long overdue national reckoning happening. But I think the Black Lives Matter movement has really been successful in creating these political situations where something had to be done, and that it was not an option. So I think this is also for us the way to go, to just what we're doing right now, right? What you have been doing, and just lifting up voices of teachers saying, how I'm getting a pink slip right now. What am I going to tell my students that I'm not going to come back after all this trauma we went through this year, right? That we're lifting up nurses saying, a week ago, everybody was clapping for me at 7 o'clock and now I'm getting laid off because there's hospital cuts, right? I think just lifting up these voices and saying, what are you going to do? Creating this crisis so that something has to be done. Sorry.
Thank you. That's okay.
Very agitated talking about.
I mean, as you know, this is a live panel. We have 1 minute and there's someone waiting in the waiting room to get on next. So I want to thank all of you. This was a really important discussion. We know it will continue. We see that this coalition work between unions and organizations is crucial to our success. So thank you so much on behalf of the PSC.